Imagine stepping into a place where the air feels wrong. A place where every creak, every whisper, seems to reach deep into your soul. Where shadows stretch further than they should, and the silence, it speaks. What if I told you some people have ventured into these places and never returned the same? These aren't ghost stories, they're real-life encounters, and tonight, we're bringing you 5 true stories so terrifying, you'll question the safety of your own home. These aren't tales you've heard before. These are the ones that will leave you breathless, staring into the dark, wondering what's lurking just beyond the light. Welcome to the unknown. Are you brave enough to face what comes next? What you're about to hear is not the stuff of imagination. These stories aren't twisted tales whispered around a campfire. They are the haunting truths of those who lived through them. People just like you, who thought they understood the world they were in. But sometimes the world shifts without warning. And when it does, it reveals horrors that cannot be explained, things that should not exist. These are accounts of fear so real, so raw, that they linger long after the doors are closed and the lights go out. Some call it madness, others call it the truth. After tonight, you'll question whether you've truly understood the world around you, or if it's been hiding something all along. Before we step deeper into this darkness, there's one thing most viewers forget to do, and it's a mistake you don't want to make. Hit that subscribe button now, so you never miss the most chilling stories that only true horror seekers dare to explore. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is there. Because here, the night is far from over, and the shadows are just beginning to stir. Now let's begin. It started innocently enough, a family moving into a quiet suburban home, hoping to leave their troubles behind. They dreamed of a fresh start, a new chapter in a place far from the noise and chaos of their old life. They had spent months searching for the perfect home, and when they found it, a cozy 2-story house at the end of a sleepy cul-de-sac, it seemed like fate. The house was perfect. The lawn was green, the trees were tall, and the air was crisp, full of the promise of new beginnings. It was everything they had hoped for and more. They unloaded boxes, set up furniture, and the house quickly began to feel like home. The father, James, could already see his children playing in the backyard, the mother, Linda, imagining her dream garden flourishing in the spring. The neighborhood felt safe, too. It was a quiet place, a suburban paradise where children rode their bikes down the street, and neighbors waved as they walked their dogs. It was a place where the family could grow, build memories, and find peace after a chaotic chapter in their lives. But what they didn't know, what they could never have imagined, was that their dream home had a dark past. The house had stood empty for years before they moved in, and the real reason why was a story no one cared to tell. They were blissfully unaware that they had moved into a house with a history far more sinister than they could have ever known. The previous owners, the ones who had left without a trace, had left behind something more than just an empty house. It was a presence, a lingering, invisible weight that would soon begin to make itself known. The neighborhood looks almost too perfect, the kind of place you could easily imagine a family being happy in. Tree-lined streets with pristine homes, well-kept lawns, and children playing outside. In the distance, the sun sets behind the rows of houses, casting long, golden shadows across the street. The whole scene feels peaceful, a picture of suburban bliss. Late one night, a shadow moved across the window. A figure, staring into their home from the darkness outside. It started off innocently enough. The family, still adjusting to their new surroundings, tried to settle into a routine. James and Linda were unpacking the final boxes, while their 2 children, Emma and Ben, were playing upstairs. The evenings were calm, but there was something about the house that felt off, like it was holding its breath, waiting. Every night, after the children were tucked in, the house would grow eerily quiet. Too quiet. The usual creaks of a house settling were now replaced with an unsettling stillness that left a knot in their stomachs. Then one evening it happened. James had been in the living room, reading the newspaper, when something caught his eye. A shadow just outside the window. He thought it was a tree branch, or perhaps a neighbor walking by, but as he looked closer, he noticed something wasn't quite right. The figure stood motionless, just outside the window, watching them from the darkness. It wasn't a passerby. It wasn't a shadow of a tree. It was a person, a figure, still and unmoving. His heart began to race. Was it someone in the neighborhood? He quickly ran to the window, but when he looked, the figure was gone. Nothing but the empty street under the moonlight. But the unease lingered. The next night, it happened again. This time, Linda noticed it, too. As she sat reading in the living room, She glanced up and saw the same figure standing outside. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes locked onto the dark shape. She quickly closed the curtains, telling herself it was just her imagination. But deep down, something was wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that someone was watching them, someone with no intention of leaving. This wasn't just an isolated event. Every night, the shadow returned, closer and closer. And then the letters began. At first, they tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe it was the trees casting shadows. But as the days went on, the sightings became more frequent. The figure outside their window would stand there, always just beyond the light, watching, waiting. Every night it came back, always closer, always more deliberate. The family began to feel the walls closing in, as though something was slowly drawing them into a trap. The fear wasn't just in the figure anymore. It was in the letters. One morning, they opened the mailbox to find an envelope, a plain, unmarked envelope. The handwriting inside was jagged, hastily written. "I see you. I know what you've done." The words were simple, but they hit like a ton of bricks. They had never shared anything like that with anyone. How could anyone know their secrets? How could anyone know their private thoughts, things they had never said aloud? At first, they thought it was a prank, a cruel joke played by someone who lived nearby. But the letters kept coming. Each one was more cryptic, more unnerving. They began to find them in strange places, in the mailbox, under the doormat, slipped between the cracks of the front door. The messages were always unsettling, each one referencing things the family had never shared. "You can't hide from me," one letter warned, written in ink that appeared smudged and hurried, as though written by someone desperate. The family's anxiety grew. They locked the doors, closed the windows, but no matter what they did, they could never escape the feeling of being watched. At night, they would pull the curtains tightly shut, but still, the shadow outside remained, just beyond their sight. It was always there, watching. They searched their yard, they searched the neighborhood. No one saw anything. No one knew anything. The feeling that someone or something was out there lurking became unbearable. The final night came, when the figure appeared at the door. This time, the family was ready. But they soon realized the man they were confronting was someone they knew. The night had grown cold, and the air outside felt heavy, thick with dread. The family could no longer sit in silence. They had been waiting for this moment for days, wondering if they would ever find out who, or what, was tormenting them. The father, James, had locked all the doors and windows, but the fear still lingered. He stood in the living room, trying to steady his nerves, but his heart pounded in his chest like a drum. Then the doorbell rang. 3 sharp, jarring rings that cut through the silence like a knife. James rushed to the door, his pulse racing. He peeked through the peephole, but saw nothing. The porch was empty, still and silent. With trembling hands, he opened the door. And there, standing in the doorway, was a familiar face, one he never expected to see. It was their neighbor, Thomas, the man who lived across the street. He had always seemed friendly, always stopping by to greet them when they first moved in. But now there was something off about him. His eyes were wide, unnaturally wide, like they were too big for his face, and his smile was twisted in a way that sent a chill down James's spine. "I've been watching you," Thomas said in a low, eerie voice. "I've seen everything." James stood frozen, his blood running cold. It was him. He had been the one outside their window, the one sending the letters. The man they had trusted, the man they had spoken to, was the one who had been stalking them all along. He was the one who had been watching them from the shadows, from behind the safety of their own windows. It wasn't just the house that was haunted, it was the man. He had been watching them for years, manipulating events from behind the scenes. It turned out that Thomas wasn't just a neighbor. He had been secretly watching the family from the moment they moved in, learning their routines, their fears, and their deepest secrets. The letters had been his way of controlling them, of making them feel helpless, of drawing them closer to the edge. He had been orchestrating every moment, every shadow, every flicker of light, and when the time was right, he would confront them. When the police arrived, they uncovered a twisted web of surveillance. Hidden cameras were found all over the house, inside, outside, in places no one could have suspected. Thomas had been watching them, documenting their every move, learning everything about them. But it wasn't just the family. Thomas had done this to other families before, stalking them, leaving them terrorized, and then moving on to his next target. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts, it was haunted by him. The family left the house that night, never to return. They moved far away, unable to erase the memories of the nightmare they had endured. But even as they drove away, they knew that Thomas was still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting for the next family to come along. Nestled in the middle of a forgotten park, there stood a playground, eerily well-maintained. But no one had seen a child there in years. The swings, though rusted and worn, moved gently in the wind, creaking as if responding to an invisible force. The slide, though chipped with age, gleamed under the dim light of dusk. The sandbox, untouched by the usual dirt and debris, appeared pristine, an oddity in a place that had long been abandoned. And yet, no children played here. No laughter echoed through the empty air. It was as if the playground existed outside of time, frozen in a moment long past, a relic of a happier time that had been swallowed by the shadows. Locals had long avoided the place, preferring to walk around it, steering clear of its dark aura. Whispers of strange happenings circulated like fog, rumors of children who had vanished without a trace, only for their laughter to echo in the night air. The playground wasn't just a place, it was a story, a warning, whispered from one fearful soul to the next. Those who had dared venture into the park at night spoke of eerie sounds, of shadows moving without form, and of eyes that seemed to watch from the darkness. It was a place that had been forgotten by time, but the memory of it still clung to the town like a persistent, suffocating fog. Those brave enough to pass near the gates of the playground felt a chill in the air, a prickling sensation along their skin, as though someone was waiting. But no one spoke openly of the place anymore. It was simply known as the park that time forgot, and with good reason. The small town was quiet, almost too quiet. Nestled in the quiet outskirts was a park that few dared to visit. It was a forgotten area, tucked far away from the lively bustle of town. The park had seen better days, its pathways cracked, its benches covered in moss, and its trees reaching out like twisted limbs. The playground itself stood at the center of it all, hidden beneath the canopy of tall trees and obscured by overgrown grass. No one could remember the last time the park had been visited by children. In daylight, the park appeared untouched by time, yet, as evening descended, a heavy shadow seemed to descend on the place. The park, though peaceful at first glance, emanated an unsettling presence, as though it was waiting for something to stir. The air in the park was still, almost unnaturally so, and the wind carried with it a faint whisper, a sound that could almost be mistaken for children's laughter if one wasn't paying close attention. One day, a curious visitor came across the playground. They had heard the stories, of course, the whispering rumors of strange happenings and the odd occurrences in the park. But they had brushed it off as nothing more than local folklore, stories passed down through generations of fearful townsfolk. To them, the playground was just an abandoned, forgotten relic, nothing more. So when they stumbled upon it, they felt the pull of curiosity, the strange desire to uncover the truth of the place that had been so deliberately ignored by everyone else. They entered the park, their steps slow at first, cautious, as if they too could feel the weight of the air. The sky above was an overcast gray, the sunlight weak and scattered. The trees in the distance bent inward, their long, twisted limbs creating an almost tunnel-like effect as they walked deeper into the forgotten park. The visitor couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but they kept moving forward, pushing aside the unease that had begun to settle over them like a thick fog. They stepped into the playground, the ground crunching beneath their boots, the old, weathered playground equipment standing silent as if waiting. As they wandered deeper into the park, something odd caught their attention. It began faintly, just a whisper in the wind, so subtle that they thought it might be their imagination. But as they paused, listening carefully, it became clearer. Laughter, soft and distant at first, like the giggling of a child, but there were no children around. No one else was in sight. The visitor glanced around, trying to locate the source of the sound, but the playground was still. Empty, silent. Yet the laughter persisted, rising and falling like a soft melody, echoing around the trees, bouncing off the worn, abandoned swing set, swirling in the air around them like a ghostly presence. The visitor felt the hairs on the back of their neck rise, the hairs on their arms standing on end. There was something unsettling about that laughter, something wrong. It was too hollow, too distant, too unreal. The visitor took another step, heart racing, the laughter growing louder as they walked deeper into the park. They shook their head, trying to dismiss the sound as the wind, as a trick of their mind. But the laughter didn't stop. It followed them, as if the children were playing just out of sight, just behind the trees. And then it began to change. The laughter didn't sound joyful anymore. It started to distort, taking on a twisted edge, an undertone of something darker, something that felt less like play and more like something else entirely. The visitor's breath caught in their throat as the sound of children's laughter turned to something more insistent, more chilling. It wasn't just giggles now. It was a call, a beckoning from the shadows. The laughter, once innocent and playful, began to change. It shifted, twisting and warping, taking on a darker, more insidious tone. The sweet, carefree giggles became distant, as if they were no longer just the sounds of children at play. The sound now felt closer, but more haunting, like it was coming from the very air around them. The laughter became faint whispers, snaking through the trees, wrapping around the visitor like a shadow that refused to let go. The voices were indecipherable at first, barely audible, but then they began to form into something more. Words, soft at first, just murmurs, barely a breath above the wind. But they were there. The visitor's heart began to pound as the whispers grew louder, more distinct, curling around them like tendrils of darkness, clawing at their sanity. Then, the whispers turned into cries, sharp, desperate, filled with sorrow. A child's cry, a pleading voice echoing through the wind. "Help me." It was so real, so raw, that the visitor's breath caught in their throat. Their body tensed, eyes scanning the playground, the eerie sound of cries now flooding the park. But still no one was there. The cries faded, only to be replaced by something worse, something far more terrifying. Their own name. Soft at first, like a whisper, but then louder, clearer, as if the very air around them was speaking it. "Come closer." The voice called, each syllable sending a chill deep into the visitor's bones. It was unmistakable. It was their name, called out from the shadows. But the voice wasn't coming from anywhere in particular. It felt like it was everywhere. It seemed to resonate in their head, in their chest, as if the ground itself was speaking. The visitor stood frozen, unable to move, their body trapped in place by the invisible weight of the voices. The laughter, the cries, and the whispers mixed together now, creating a cacophony of sound that was both maddening and hypnotic. The visitor's thoughts were becoming clouded, their mind overwhelmed by the sound. The air around them grew heavier, as though the world itself was sinking under the weight of the invisible force that surrounded them. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, making it feel as if the park itself was alive, its roots stretching deeper into the earth, pulling them in. With every passing second, the visitor felt their grip on reality slipping. Their legs were shaking, their heart racing in their chest, but no matter how hard they tried to move, their feet remained rooted to the spot. They couldn't escape. The name, their name, was still echoing in their ears, reverberating like a heartbeat, growing louder, closer. And then, the laughter started again, this time mixed with a low, guttural sound. It wasn't the laughter of children anymore. It was something darker, something far more sinister. It was as if the very souls of the playground had come alive, drawn to the visitor, calling them, wanting them to stay. Forever. Suddenly, the visitor felt the temperature drop. The air around them grew frigid, and a heavy silence fell like a shroud, muffling the sound of the wind and the distant cries. The laughter and whispers ceased, replaced by an oppressive stillness that made their chest tighten. It was as though the entire park had stopped breathing, holding its collective breath. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, as if the earth was rearranging itself, closing in on them, trapping them in this forsaken place. They turned around slowly, their heart hammering in their chest, and that's when they felt it, the shadows. They were no longer just figures in the corners of their vision. No, now the shadows had taken form, moving toward them with a steady, deliberate pace. The trees seemed to sway in a rhythm that mimicked the movement of the shadows, as if the very woods had come alive, bending toward the visitor, closing off every path of escape. Before they could move, before they could even scream, the figures emerged. Children. But they were not the playful children the visitor had imagined. These children were different, dark, twisted, and wrong in every way. Their bodies were cloaked in darkness, as if shadows had become their skin, swirling around them like an ethereal fog. Their faces were pale, unnaturally so, their features gaunt and hollow. Their eyes, those eyes, were black voids, empty, soulless, staring straight through the visitor, as if they were looking into the very core of their being. The visitor's breath caught in their throat. The children did not speak. They did not laugh. They simply stared, unmoving, their hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural, malevolent light. The visitor backed away, panic clawing at their chest, their legs refusing to carry them fast enough. The ground beneath them felt like it was giving way, as if they were sinking into the earth itself. They could feel the heavy presence of the children closing in, the weight of their eyes growing unbearable, pressing on them like an invisible force. One of the children stepped forward, their feet dragging along the ground in slow, deliberate steps, as though each movement was a struggle against the darkness that enveloped them. The air grew colder still, and the visitor could see their breath forming in front of them, like mist in the dead of winter. The child who had stepped forward raised one skeletal hand, pointing directly at the visitor. A sound like dry leaves crunching underfoot emanated from them, but it wasn't a sound. It was more of a feeling, a vibration that rattled the visitor's bones. Their heart pounded in their ears, drowning out the whispers of the other children who had now surrounded them, closing the circle tighter with every passing second. The visitor was trapped, with nowhere to run. The darkness felt alive, pressing in on them from every direction. The child's voice, hollow and raspy, echoed in their head. "You should have never come." And then the shadows took shape, forming into something more, something worse. The temperature plunged further, and the visitor was overcome by a sense of suffocating dread. The children's mouths opened, but no sound came out. Instead, the world around them seemed to distort. The trees warped into grotesque shapes. The swings began to move violently, their chains rattling like 1,000 nails being driven into the ground. The figures closed in even further, their black eyes burning into the visitor's soul, a weight of unbearable evil pressing down on them like the world was coming to an end. And just as they felt the darkness envelop them completely, the children lunged forward, cloaked in shadows, their hands reaching out, cold as ice, with fingers stretched like claws, ready to drag them into the abyss. The visitor fled, their body moving on instinct, every fiber of their being screaming for escape. They turned and ran, pushing through the thickening darkness, their feet barely finding the ground beneath them. The children's laughter followed them, echoing in the air like a haunting melody that refused to fade. The shadows stretched out before them, as if trying to swallow them whole, but the visitor couldn't stop. They ran blindly, their breath ragged, their legs burning, the sound of the children's eerie whispers growing louder with every step they took. Every corner they turned only seemed to bring them back to the same place, the playground, that cursed spot, where the figures were waiting, where the darkness threatened to consume them. It was as though the very land had become a maze, the trees twisting and bending unnaturally, blocking any path out. The visitor's heart raced, their mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Every breath was more difficult than the last, as if the air itself was thickening, making it harder to move. The darkness seemed to close in, and the whispers grew to a maddening crescendo. The visitors stumbled, their knees weak with exhaustion, and for a brief moment, they thought they saw a flash of light, a way out, perhaps, a break in the dark. But as they approached, it vanished, swallowed by the endless shadows, and they were back at the playground. Again, in their final moments of sanity, the visitor understood. They weren't just running from the playground, they were running from themselves, from something far deeper, far darker than they had realized. As they finally stumbled toward the exit, gasping for air, their mind racing with the horrors they had just witnessed, they made a final desperate attempt to escape the playground. But it was too late. Years later, when the visitor had long since left the town and tried to forget what had happened, the nightmares never stopped. They were haunted, each night filled with the sounds of children's laughter, whispers in the dark, and the hollow, cold eyes of those they had seen in the park. It wasn't until much later, after the visitor had found peace, or so they thought, that they learned the horrifying truth. The playground was a trap for lost souls, souls who wandered too close, souls who could not resist the lure of the dark. The children were not real children. They were the spirits of those who had come before, trapped in that place for eternity, bound to the park by the curse that lingered within its boundaries. The swings still moved, the laughter still echoed, but all of it was a trap, luring the curious, the unwary to join them. The souls who vanished from the town, they had been claimed by the playground, and now the visitor knew there was no escape. The playground never let go. It had claimed them too, and they would never be free. It was an old hospital on the outskirts of town, left to decay after rumors of unspeakable experiments surfaced. No one in the town dared to venture near it, speaking of it only in hushed, nervous whispers. The building stood at the edge of town, its looming silhouette casting long shadows at twilight, a silent reminder of what had been, and of what had been buried. The townspeople knew the stories all too well. Rumors of doctors conducting inhumane experiments on patients, treatments that went far beyond any moral code, tests that twisted the human body and mind beyond recognition. But those were just rumors, weren't they? No one could confirm the details. All that was known for sure was that after a series of strange disappearances and a flood of patient complaints, the hospital was abandoned, left to crumble into ruin, its walls decaying, its once sterile floors now dusted with the passage of time. But the stories never stopped. No one would go near the place after dark. The town kept its distance, and the hospital, with its sagging roofs and cracked windows, stood as a forgotten relic. But beneath its crumbling facade, something lingered, something that had never truly been laid to rest. The hospital, once a place of life and care, now stood as a monument to decay. Its once pristine walls, now covered in layers of peeling paint, revealed the old brick beneath, cracked and stained. The floors, once polished and clean, were now littered with dust and broken glass, the smell of mildew thick in the air. The sterile, white corridors that had once been filled with the sounds of staff and patients were now eerily silent, save for the occasional creaking of old wooden beams or the scurrying of rats in the dark. Medical equipment lay abandoned in the hallways. Old four-poles, rusted surgical tools, and tattered patient records scattered across forgotten corners, all coated in a layer of grime and neglect. Faded, yellowed signs indicated rooms that no one dared to enter, while in the distance, the dim flicker of light from broken fluorescent bulbs created haunting, distorted shadows that stretched and danced along the walls. The silence in the hospital was oppressive, broken only by the occasional distant sound. A door creaking open, the soft shuffle of something unseen moving in the dark. A group of thrill-seekers, eager to prove their courage and seek adventure, decided to explore the abandoned hospital. They had heard the stories, the chilling whispers from the townsfolk, the tales of the disappeared patients and the dark experiments that had been carried out in the hospital's hidden rooms. But to them, these were just that, stories. Nothing more. They were used to exploring abandoned buildings, seeking out the places that everyone else feared to tread. They thought of this as just another night of thrills. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they set foot into the hospital, each of them excited to uncover the secrets hidden within its decaying walls. As they stepped over the threshold, a strange weight settled in the air, a silence so deep that it felt unnatural. It was the kind of silence that made every footstep feel too loud, as though the building itself was listening, waiting. The temperature dropped sharply, as though the warmth of the outside world had been locked out. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, but it was as though the light didn't quite reach the corners of the rooms. Every flicker of light, every creak of the floorboards beneath their feet, seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive stillness. The building felt alive, not in the way a house is alive, with the sounds of creaks and groans, but in a more sinister way, like it was watching them. The group moved forward slowly, the air thick with the smell of mildew and rust, the scent of decay hanging heavy in the corners. They wandered deeper into the hospital, their steps echoing off the crumbling walls. The group split into two smaller groups, some exploring the hallways, while others ventured into the rooms. They marveled at the faded patient charts on the walls, the broken furniture left behind, and the old medical equipment that lay discarded and covered in dust. But the further they went, the more unsettled they became. The air grew colder, and the oppressive silence felt heavier. It wasn't just that the hospital was empty. It was as if the building itself was waiting for them, as though it was expecting them to be there, to disturb the peace that had lingered for so many years. It felt as though the very walls were watching them. They joked nervously, trying to laugh off the growing sense of unease, but even the sound of their voices felt out of place in this place of forgotten horrors. Something was off, something they couldn't quite name. But deep down, each of them knew they weren't alone. The deeper they ventured into the hospital, the more the sense of unease began to build. It wasn't just the silence anymore, it was the feeling that they were being watched. At first, it was a sensation, a vague prickling on the back of their necks. But as they moved deeper into the building, it became undeniable. Shadows in the corners of the rooms began to stretch longer than they should, and every sound, no matter how small, felt like an intrusion in the heavy quiet. They began to hear things, soft whispers just beyond the edge of hearing, like distant voices murmuring in the dark. One of them, a young man named Kyle, swore he saw something move in the hallway just ahead. A flash of a figure, a shadow that seemed too human to be a trick of the light. But when they all rushed to check, the hallway was empty, save for the crumbling walls and overturned medical equipment. The whispers grew louder, and soon, it became impossible to ignore them. They were not in the halls now, but in the rooms, low, guttural voices, faint but unmistakable. The voices weren't speaking English, but but the feeling of terror that accompanied them was universal. They were coming from the walls themselves, the very building seeming to hum with a malevolent energy. But then things took a turn. As they reached the back part of the hospital, the air turned inexplicably cold, a biting chill that sank deep into their bones. Kyle, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, stepped away from the group, heading toward the back storage room. His flashlight flickered and buzzed, sputtering out in the midst of his movements. His breath formed visible clouds in the air, and as he turned around, he swore he saw someone standing at the far end of the room. Someone tall, almost too tall. "Hey guys," Kyle called, his voice shaking. But as he spoke, the whispering grew louder, louder still, until it became an urgent, frantic sound, rising like a crescendo in the room. Something was happening. Something was moving closer. He didn't have time to turn back to the group. The light in his flashlight went out completely, plunging him into complete darkness. There, in the silence that followed, he heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching him from the shadows. It wasn't human, whatever it was, whatever had been in that hospital for so long, watching from the corners, from behind the walls. The footsteps grew closer, and Kyle felt a cold hand graze his shoulder. He spun around, but there was no one there. Just shadows, long and twisted, clinging to the walls like living things. He turned to run, but something caught his foot, sending him sprawling to the ground. The cold, wet hands of the floor seemed to hold him in place. He struggled, but the hands, the whispers, everything seemed to press in on him, forcing him deeper into the dark. As the group rushed to find Kyle, they stumbled across a room that wasn't in any of the hospital's blueprints. The door, which had been partially hidden behind a tangle of broken equipment, creaked open with the smallest touch, revealing what lay beyond. The room was nothing like the sterile, functional spaces they had seen before. This room was different. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched into the stone, like something far older than the hospital itself. The air in the room was thick with the smell of decay, and the floor was slick with something viscous and dark. As they entered, they noticed the equipment, a series of old, outdated medical machines, their wires coiled like snakes on the floor. But it was the tables that caught their attention, 6 of them, arranged in a circle. They were strapped down with old leather restraints, stained with dark splotches that didn't look like blood. And then there were the faces, strange, misshapen faces, frozen in silent screams, disfigured beyond recognition. The bodies of those who had been experimented on, patients, victims, left behind in a cruel mockery of medical practice. They had been torn apart, their limbs stretched and contorted in ways that no human body should ever be. The horrors that had taken place in this room were unspeakable, the evidence of suffering so extreme that it seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating. One of the group members, a woman named Sarah, felt herself drawn to one of the tables. Her hand reached out involuntarily, touching one of the restraints, and as she did, a rush of images flooded her mind. Visions of the patients, the doctors, the endless experiments. She gasped, pulling her hand away, but the images remained, burned into her vision. Then, the floor beneath them creaked, and a distant noise echoed through the building. Something was alive in the hospital. Something had been waiting for them to discover this room. The group was paralyzed in that room, surrounded by the remnants of twisted experiments and a history of unspeakable horrors. Their minds struggled to process what they had just discovered, but the air in the room thickened, and the reality of their situation crashed down on them with an undeniable force. They were not alone. The whispers, once distant, now became sharp, insistent. The floor groaned beneath their feet, as if the hospital itself was waking up, stretching out its decayed limbs to claim them. It was too much to bear. The walls felt as though they were closing in on them, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that their breath turned to visible mist in the air. A strange, guttural sound echoed from the hall outside, something dragging itself across the floor, slow and deliberate. A scraping noise. The group huddled together, panic rising in their chests. What was that? What had they uncovered? They had been foolish to think they could escape this place unharmed. They had uncovered the truth, but the truth was far worse than they could have ever imagined. The sound of footsteps, heavy dragging, grew louder, closer. The door to the room creaked open slowly, and the group tensed, the air thick with fear. But what entered was not a person, not a human. No, this thing was something else. It was a distorted figure, shrouded in shadows, its limbs twisted unnaturally. It moved in jerking, twitching motions, its face an endless void of pale, rotting flesh and empty sockets void of eyes. The creature's hands reached out, long fingers with jagged, broken nails that scraped across the walls. The whispers grew louder, and the group felt the presence of more, something in the darkness. The floor beneath their feet cracked, and as one of the group members screamed, they realized the hospital was alive, the experiments had never stopped, and they were now a part of its history. The thing lunged forward, its mouth opening wide, but it wasn't human. It was a creature, a nightmare forged from pain and suffering. The group scattered, running for the exit, but the hallway was no longer the way they had come. The building seemed to shift, the walls closing in behind them, trapping them in its maze. The hospital had become a living nightmare, and it was hungry. By the time they made it back to the entrance, breathless and panicked, they realized something chilling. They were no longer the only ones who had been trapped here. One of them, Sarah, had been left behind. Her eyes were wide, filled with terror, as she stared back toward the hall, her hands still gripping the doorframe, as though she was caught between two worlds. The group screamed, pulling at her, but Sarah's body trembled violently as the doors slammed shut with a force that echoed through the building. The last thing they saw was her outstretched hand, reaching toward them, but it was too late. Sarah had been claimed, and the hospital, with its endless shadows, would never let her go. As the group fled the hospital's threshold, the doors locked behind them with a loud, final thud. The dark, oppressive presence of the building loomed over them as they ran. But when they looked back, the hospital stood silent again, as if it had never been disturbed. Yet, the whispers continued, faint but undeniable, lingering on the wind. It was said that one of them still wanders the halls at night, trying to escape what followed them out, trying to escape the darkness that had attached itself to them. But no one knows for sure. Some say the hospital claimed one of them too, a parting gift from the twisted experiments that had been conducted inside. One weekend, a group of friends set out for a getaway in the woods. They were excited, looking forward to a weekend away from the noise of the city, to unwind and reconnect in the serenity of nature. Armed with backpacks, snacks, and plenty of enthusiasm, they ventured into the wilderness, hiking for hours under the canopy of towering trees. The sound of birds chirping and the rustling of leaves in the breeze filled the air, adding to the sense of calm that surrounded them. They were deep in the woods now, far from any road or sign of civilization, the path they followed barely visible beneath the thick blanket of fallen leaves. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail, but the group remained in high spirits, unaware of the strange presence that loomed ahead. But as the trail twisted and turned, they began to notice something off. The air felt heavier, colder, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed to fall silent. That was when they saw it. Hidden away in a dense thicket, surrounded by trees that seemed to lean in close as though watching, stood a cabin. Its weathered wood and sagging roof looked out of place against the vibrant green of the forest, like it didn't belong there. The eerie quiet that enveloped it seemed unnatural, a stark contrast to the lively sounds of the forest they had just been surrounded by. There it was, an isolated structure that appeared to have been forgotten by time, just waiting for them to stumble upon it. The cabin was tucked away in the heart of the forest, far from the beaten path. It sat alone, its presence unsettling in its isolation. The trees surrounding it were tall and dense, casting long, foreboding shadows that seemed to stretch toward the cabin like fingers reaching out to claim it. The air grew heavier as the group approached, the usual rustling of leaves and chirping of birds fading into an uncomfortable silence. There was no sign of life around the cabin, not a single animal, not a single person. It was as if the forest itself had abandoned this place, leaving it to decay in peace. But there was something else, something that the group couldn't put their finger on. The closer they got to the cabin, the more the hairs on the back of their necks stood up. It was as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to cross the threshold. They decided to stay the night. After all, the cabin was secluded and picturesque in its own eerie way. The friends, eager to escape the chaos of their everyday lives, figured it would be the perfect opportunity to relax. The evening began innocently enough. They unpacked their bags, set up a small fire in the hearth, and sat around it, talking and laughing, attempting to ignore the odd, unsettling feeling in the pit of their stomachs. But as the night wore on, things began to feel off. The warmth of the fire did little to push back the chill in the air, and a sense of quiet unease seemed to seep into every corner of the cabin. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside, the air was still and cold, as if the building itself were holding its breath. It started with the lights. At first, it was just a flicker, barely noticeable, as if the power was unstable. But then, the flickering grew more frequent, First one light, then another, until the entire cabin seemed to pulse with the flickering glow of the old, dim bulbs. Each time the lights dimmed, a low hum filled the room, like an electrical current running beneath the walls. The group exchanged nervous glances, trying to rationalize the strange occurrence. But as the lights flickered again, this time longer, casting deep shadows on the walls, a sudden coldness swept through the room. The fire sputtered, casting erratic shadows, and the room felt inexplicably colder. Then, objects started moving. It began with the slightest motion, a book sliding off a shelf, a chair creaking back slightly, as if someone had just gotten up. At first, they tried to laugh it off, blaming the house's age or the wind outside. But when the old rocking chair by the fireplace began rocking back and forth on its own, they could no longer ignore it. The sound of the creaking would grew louder, more pronounced, as though the chair had a mind of its own. One of the group members, Ethan, stood up to inspect it, but as he approached the chair, it suddenly stopped rocking, dead still. The silence was deafening. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing the armrest, but before he could touch it, a loud bang echoed through the cabin, coming from the other side of the room. A cupboard door had slammed shut on its own. The group froze, their faces pale. "It's just the house settling," one of them whispered, though their voice trembled. But no one believed that anymore. The air felt too heavy, too thick. Every footstep seemed to echo, every whisper felt like a threat. And then the whispers began. At first, they thought it was just the wind again, but as the minutes passed, the whispers grew clearer. They were coming from inside the walls. Low voices, indistinct at first, then becoming more pronounced. The words were impossible to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. There was something insistent about them, something desperate. It felt as if the walls were alive, breathing in the space around them, feeding on their fear. The cabin had a presence, something ancient and malevolent, and it had been waiting for them to arrive. As the night grew deeper, it became clear. This wasn't just an old cabin in the woods. This place had been waiting for them, and whatever had happened here before, it was far from over. As the night wore on, the strange occurrences continued to escalate. The whispers, once subtle, had now become clear and insistent. They were no longer just fleeting sounds. They were voices, distinct though faint. At first, the group tried to ignore them, convincing themselves it was just the wind or the building settling. But deep down, each of them could feel the truth creeping in. There was something inside the cabin, something that was awake. The sounds didn't stop. In fact, they began to take on a more malicious tone, growing louder, more pronounced. Each time the wind gusted through the trees outside, the whispers became more urgent, more intense, as if the cabin itself was alive, breathing in the voices of the past. A sudden chill swept through the room, and the fire, which had been crackling merrily only moments before, suddenly sputtered, dimming the light and casting the room into an eerie twilight. Shadows danced on the walls, stretching like fingers reaching for them. The flickering light revealed something, or someone, standing in the far corner of the room, just out of sight. Lydia, the bravest of the group, stood up first, her legs trembling as she slowly approached the corner. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached out toward the shadow. But just as her hand was about to touch the wall, the whispering grew louder, more frantic. "Leave now, please." The voice, though faint, was unmistakable. It sounded like a plea, a desperate cry for help. Lydia recoiled, stumbling back into the group. They all looked at one another, the fear in their eyes growing. The voices were no longer in the walls, they were in the room with them. And they were getting closer. The ground beneath them began to groan. The cabin seemed to shift, its walls trembling slightly as if it were a living, breathing entity. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and as each of them moved, the sound of footsteps echoed louder than before. Footsteps that didn't belong to any of them. They were being followed. They weren't alone. As the whispers continued to echo, the group's fear reached its peak. They needed to leave, but the door, the only escape, was nowhere to be found. It wasn't just locked, it was sealed. The walls had closed in around them, trapping them in the cabin with whatever malevolent force had inhabited it. Panic set in. The windows were covered with heavy drapes, the glass so fogged and thick that it was impossible to see through. They rushed to the windows, pushing against the curtains, but the thick glass refused to budge. Something had trapped them here. Then something caught Sarah's eye. A door. A door at the far end of the room, hidden in the shadows, completely unnoticed until now. It wasn't on the map they had seen earlier. It wasn't even on the cabin's floor plan. As the group made their way toward it, the whispers grew louder, filling their ears with frantic pleas. "Don't open it, don't open it." Sarah hesitated but turned the handle, pushing open the door to reveal something far worse than they could have imagined. The room was unlike anything in the rest of the cabin. It was small, cramped, the air thick with the smell of mildew and rot. But the thing that struck them the most was the table in the center of the room. A surgical table, stained with dark patches that could only be blood. Strapped to the table was a figure, though it wasn't quite human. It was a man, or had been, a grotesque figure, with parts of his body twisted and sewn together in impossible shapes. His face was contorted, his eyes open wide, frozen in a scream that would never leave. And beside him, an array of medical tools, scalpels, syringes, and rusty needles, all used in ways no doctor would dare imagine. The room seemed to pulse with the terror of its past, as if the very air had absorbed the agony and fear that had once filled it. The figure on the table twitched, just slightly, a faint movement that no one could ignore. It was still alive, and it wasn't alone. As the group stood frozen in horror, they realized the twisted truth of the cabin. It wasn't just a building. It was a place where horrors were committed, where pain, suffering, and death had been artificially prolonged in ways that twisted human nature. The whispers, the cold spots, the lights flickering, everything now made sense. The cabin had been a place for dark experiments, and the bodies of those who had been used and discarded were left behind in its walls. The thing on the table wasn't the only one. It couldn't be. But before they could make sense of what they were seeing, the figure on the table twitched again, this time more violently. Its limbs jerked in unnatural movements, its eyes still locked in that silent scream. And then, just as Sarah turned to leave, her foot stepping back into the hallway, the figure's mouth opened and a sound emerged. A whisper, soft but unmistakably clear. "Get out." It wasn't a warning. It was a command. It was desperate. It was pleading. The room grew colder, and the temperature seemed to drop to an unbearable chill, as though the room itself was closing in around them. The figure on the table opened its mouth wider, the air thickening with an ominous presence, and then, to their utter horror, the group saw it. Other figures began to emerge from the shadows in the room. They were not dead. They were like the one on the table, bodies grotesquely stitched together, eyes wide, limbs twisted unnaturally, their faces frozen in screams. The room was not just occupied by this figure. It had been filled with others, all frozen in time, suspended in the agony they had suffered. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Leave, leave." It wasn't just one voice. It was the voices of the other figures, the bodies, the spirits that had been tortured and left to decay. The walls themselves seemed to tremble as though the building was alive with their suffering, the wooden beams creaking and groaning as if it were breathing in agony. Panic overtook the group. They tried to flee, but as they turned to run, the room seemed to stretch impossibly long. The door that had once been behind them now seemed miles away, the walls pressing in as though the cabin itself was alive, closing them in. No matter how fast they ran, they could not escape. The cabin was a trap. The spirits of those who had suffered here were not gone. They were still there, still trapped, still hungry. Hungry for souls. Hungry for the living. One by one, the group began to realize the horrifying truth. The cabin had never been abandoned. It was a prison for the souls of those who had been experimented on, and now they had come to claim new victims. The door, once an escape, slammed shut, trapping them inside. And that's when they heard it, a slow, dragging sound coming from behind them. It was too late. One of the group members, Ethan, screamed, his voice cut off abruptly as something invisible reached out for him, dragging him back into the shadows. The others tried to pull him back, but the force was too powerful. It was as though the cabin had claimed him. He was gone in an instant, his body pulled into the dark recesses of the room, swallowed whole. The last thing the remaining members of the group saw was the figure on the table, its mouth opening wider as it whispered again, "You'll never leave." And with that, the door slammed shut for good. The room fell silent again, but the whispering, no, the pleading, continued. This time, it was not just from the figures in the room. It was from the very walls themselves. The spirits of the past had not been freed. They were still there, and now the group had joined them. The cabin had claimed them, just as it had claimed all those before them. The experiments never stopped. The suffering never ceased. And the group was now part of the dark history that would never fade. As the group scrambled to escape, their breath ragged and hearts pounding, it became clear. There was no way out. The door that had once been their escape route now slammed shut with an earth-shattering force. The sound echoed through the cabin, reverberating in their bones. It was as if the building itself had rejected them. The wooden beams creaked and groaned, not from the wind, but from an internal pressure, a tightening grip, as if the cabin had come alive. Every path they took seemed to lead back to the same dark, cold room, filled with the grotesque forms of the twisted figures who had once lived here, the echoes of their pain and suffering still lingering in the air. Their footsteps, frantic and panicked, were muffled as the very ground beneath them seemed to shift and sink. The walls seemed to pulse with a heartbeat, the pulse of something ancient, malevolent, and hungry. One by one, they turned to face the impossible. The walls seemed to close in on them, the once familiar layout of the cabin distorting. The shadows began to stretch unnaturally, crawling toward them, as if they were sentient, aware. Sarah's hand gripped the doorframe, her body trembling, her eyes wide with horror, but as the door slammed shut, her body was frozen in place. The feeling of being watched, of being stalked, was undeniable now. Whatever force had been hiding in the dark corners of the room was no longer waiting. It was coming for them. And then they saw it. In the farthest corner, just barely illuminated by the flickering light of the fire, the figure on the table, its limbs jerking, its grotesque body writhing, suddenly stopped. Its dark, empty eyes met theirs, and a chilling whisper filled the air. "You'll never leave." And with that, the shadows surrounding the group stretched outward, swallowing the room whole. They screamed, but the sounds were swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. The whispers grew louder, the sound of their voices now 100-fold, as the walls themselves seemed to whisper in unison, a cacophony of agonized cries and desperate pleas for release. The building, once merely a decaying relic of the past, now felt alive, breathing, pulsating with the energy of those it had consumed. And then, as if the cabin had finally made its decision, the shadows surged forward, closing in on the group, pulling them into the darkness, erasing them from the world. The last thing they saw, as they were consumed by the unyielding blackness, was the face of the figure on the table, its mouth now wide open, a scream frozen forever in its twisted expression. The cabin had claimed them. They were part of its history now, lost in time, trapped forever in the nightmare that had been created here long ago. No one would ever hear their screams again. A young woman named Olivia Carter had always dreamed of living in a quiet, cozy apartment tucked away from the bustle of the city. When she found the perfect place, a small but charming one-bedroom on the outskirts of town, she couldn't believe her luck. The neighborhood was serene, with tree-lined streets and a sense of peace that seemed too good to be true. Olivia wasted no time settling in, unpacking her belongings with excitement and a sense of newfound freedom. The apartment was just what she needed, a fresh start. She quickly made the place her own, decorating it with soft, pastel colors and small, comfortable pieces that made it feel like home. The bathroom, though small, was one of her favorite parts, old-fashioned with a vintage clawfoot tub and a sink under an ornate mirror. The mirror was antique, its wooden frame carved with delicate patterns, slightly worn from age but still beautiful. It seemed like a perfect fit for her new home, though she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something peculiar about it, an aura she couldn't quite place. But she didn't mind, brushing off the thought as nothing more than the typical unease of settling into a new place. But the moment Olivia looked into the bathroom mirror, everything changed. As she wiped her hands on a towel, preparing to head out, she glanced up and froze. At first, it was barely noticeable, a slight ripple at the edges of the glass, as though the reflection hadn't quite settled. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, but the distortion remained, subtle yet undeniable. The more she stared, the more the edges of the glass seemed to bend, as if something was slowly shifting just out of her view, something that didn't belong. At first, Olivia thought it was just her imagination. It had been a long day, unpacking, cleaning, adjusting to her new home. Maybe the stress of the move had taken its toll on her, and she was simply tired. After all, mirrors could distort reflections due to lighting or age, right? So she shrugged it off and went on with her day. But as the days passed, the strange occurrences only grew more frequent. Each time she glanced into the mirror, something felt wrong, like it was too still, too quiet. She would be brushing her hair or washing her face, and as she looked into the glass, she would notice it. The reflection would move before she did. Just a split second, but enough to unsettle her. At first, she chalked it up to exhaustion, her mind playing tricks on her, but the feeling never went away. One evening, she stood in front of the mirror brushing her teeth. She was tired, lost in thought, trying to shake the unease that had settled deep in her chest. But then, as she reached to place the toothbrush down, her reflection didn't follow her move at the same time. It was as though the reflection was ahead of her, her hand already on the counter while her real hand was still hovering near her mouth. Her breath caught in her throat, and she quickly turned her head to look at the mirror. The reflection, once again, was perfectly aligned with her. Her heart beat faster, her hands growing clammy as she looked away, but a cold sweat began to creep across her forehead. The next day it happened again. This time, as she was adjusting her shirt in front of the mirror, she noticed something far worse. She watched in horror as her reflection continued to move, but now, it wasn't simply out of sync. It seemed to have a mind of its own. Her reflection raised an eyebrow, then smirked, but Olivia hadn't moved. Her reflection smiled, a slow, mocking smile that wasn't her own. Her stomach churned as she took a step back, her hand trembling as she wiped her face, trying to shake the cold dread that had settled in. Was she seeing things? Had she finally snapped under the pressure of her new life? But the mirror wasn't just showing a trick of the light. This was something more. The distortion was clearer now. Her reflection wasn't just out of sync, it was deliberately different, mimicking her actions with a delay, but not perfectly. It wasn't her own face anymore. It was something off, something wrong. As the days passed, the disturbances grew harder to ignore. The mirror was no longer just an occasional oddity. It had become something that dominated Olivia's thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that every time she looked into it, there was something waiting for her, something that had been hiding in plain sight. At first, she convinced herself it was nothing. A trick of the light, the imperfections in the glass, the house settling around her. But deep down, Olivia knew that the mirror wasn't just showing her reflections anymore. It was showing something else, something that wasn't hers. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, she went into the bathroom to wash her face. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She turned on the faucet and splashed water onto her face, letting it run down her cheeks. As she lifted her head, she glanced up into the mirror. What she saw made her heart skip a beat. At first, it was just a shadow, a figure standing behind her in the reflection. But it wasn't her own reflection. It was someone else, a man with dark, hollow eyes, standing directly behind her. His face was obscured by shadows, but the outline of his features was unmistakable. His clothes, dark, outdated, seemed out of place, like something from another time. Olivia's breath caught in her throat, and for a brief moment, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. She whipped around, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for her. Terrified, she turned back to the mirror, her pulse racing. The figure was still there, still behind her, standing in the reflection with a chilling, vacant stare. She watched, horrified, as the figure's face seemed to twist into a smile, wide and menacing. It wasn't a smile that belonged in her reflection. It wasn't even her own expression. It was something other, something wrong. She couldn't breathe as she stared at him, the air thick with a sense of dread that suffocated her. Olivia's heart pounded, the sound in her ears so loud she thought it might drown her. She backed away from the mirror, her eyes fixed on the figure, unable to tear them away. The moment she stepped back, the man in the mirror did the same, his image shifting just a fraction of a second too late, mimicking her movements with disturbing precision. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the reflection flickered, and he was gone, as though he had never been there. But the room was no longer silent. A low hum filled the air, a buzzing noise that grew louder, as if the walls themselves were vibrating. Olivia's breath came in shallow gasps, her legs trembling beneath her. She turned away from the mirror, but the echo of the figure remained in her mind, his hollow eyes staring into her soul. It was as if he had left something behind, a presence that lingered in the space between the reflection and reality. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those dark eyes. They were always there watching, and when she dared to look back at the mirror, she knew he would be waiting. The reflection wasn't just broken, it was becoming something else. Something that wanted her. And the more she looked into it, the more she understood. The mirror didn't reflect her anymore. It reflected something that had been waiting for her to arrive. And now that she was here, it wasn't going to let her leave. When she turned around, the figure was gone, but it left a message. Olivia's heart hammered in her chest as she spun around in a desperate attempt to escape whatever nightmare had just unfolded. The bathroom was empty, silent still, just as it had been moments ago. The air was cold, a heavy, unnatural chill that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her chest tight with terror. She stared at the empty room, trying to convince herself that it had all been a trick of the light, a figment of her overactive imagination. But deep down, she knew that the reflection had been real. And it was still here. Her eyes darted back to the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, perfectly normal, like nothing had happened at all. There was no figure, no man with hollow eyes, no twisted smile. Just her. Just Olivia, standing in front of the mirror. For a moment, she thought she might be losing her mind. But then, as she took a step closer to the mirror, something caught her eye. A slight shift in the glass, a subtle change in the reflection. There, at the bottom of the mirror, the reflection was different. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow that moved too quickly. But then, as she leaned in, her breath caught in her throat. The reflection's surface shimmered for a brief moment, and slowly, the words appeared. "Get out!" The letters formed in the glass, the words as clear and sharp as if they had been etched there with a knife. Olivia recoiled, her body trembling, her blood running cold. She reached out a hand to touch the glass, to feel the surface and reassure herself that it was just a trick. But as her fingers made contact with the cool mirror, the glass rippled beneath her touch, like water, distorting the words even further. The coldness of the glass seeped into her skin, as if something was pulling her into the mirror, as if it wanted to swallow her whole. She stepped back quickly, her pulse racing. The message had been written so clearly, so deliberately, and yet it felt wrong, too real. She looked around the room, her mind spinning, trying to make sense of the impossible. But the bathroom, her apartment, the entire world around her had begun to feel alien. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker. Then a loud bang, sharp and jarring, sounded from inside the mirror. It wasn't from the room around her, but from within the reflection. The noise echoed through the bathroom, and the glass seemed to quiver in response, vibrating with an unnatural force. Olivia's breath caught in her throat, and before she could react, the reflection in the mirror changed again. The figure, the one she had seen earlier, was back. This time, its features were clearer than ever before. It was standing directly behind her, but this time, it wasn't a reflection, it was something else. The figure moved closer, its hollow eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her feel as though it was reaching out to her. The mouth stretched wide into a grin, a grotesque, mocking smile that sent a surge of terror coursing through her veins. Without warning, the figure reached out of the mirror. Its hand, pale and elongated, emerged from the glass like a shadow that had gained life. Olivia stumbled backward in a panic, but the hand followed her, its cold, skeletal fingers inching closer. Her breath was caught in her throat, and she could feel the pressure of its presence, the unrelenting chill of its touch. The mirror had stopped being a reflection. It had become a doorway. In an instant, the hand was on her, grabbing her wrist with an iron grip that felt like ice. She screamed, pulling with all her strength, but the figure's hold was unyielding. It pulled her toward the mirror, dragging her closer with unnatural force. The walls of the bathroom seemed to bend, twisting around her as if the space itself was warping to make way for something far darker. The last thing Olivia saw before her body was pulled toward the mirror was the twisted figure's grin widening, the darkness in its eyes swallowing her whole. The mirror had claimed her, and as she was dragged into it, her body fading into the glass, the last thing Olivia heard was that same cold whisper from the depths of the reflection. "You'll never leave." The bathroom was silent again, save for the faint, eerie hum of the refrigerator in the next room, as the mirror settled back into its place, now empty, no longer reflecting the world it once mirrored, but hiding the horror it had consumed. No one would ever find Olivia again, and the mirror would wait, patiently, for the next person foolish enough to look too long. The woman fled, her heart pounding, as the air around her thickened with dread. She couldn't bear to stay a moment longer in that apartment. The reflection in the mirror, the words, had made it impossible to ignore the truth. It wasn't just a piece of glass. It was a doorway, a bridge to something dark and hungry. She left everything behind, her belongings, her life in that apartment, all of it, but she couldn't escape the nightmare the mirror had unleashed. As she walked away from the apartment for the last time, she knew one thing for certain. The mirror wasn't just a passive reflection. It was a predator, and the woman, she had just become its latest victim. But to this day, the mirror remains in that apartment, waiting for its next victim. Its surface reflects only darkness now, but if you look closely enough, you can hear it. A faint whisper, soft at first, like a breath. And then it grows louder, becoming an insistent, frantic plea. The whispers never stop. They've been waiting, you see. Waiting for the next person who will dare to look into it. For whoever moves into that apartment next. the mirror will be there, patiently biding its time, waiting for you. Which story left you the most terrified? Have you ever experienced something you can't explain? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more terrifying true stories. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, not everything is as it seems.